January 3rd, 2026, 4:47 a.m. local time. United States Special Forces breach a compound in Caracas. Within 90 minutes, Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela for 12 years, architect of the worst peacetime economic collapse in modern history, is in American custody. The oil is ours now. 300 billion barrels, 17% of global proven reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iraq and Kuwait combined. Donald Trump announces a $400 billion reconstruction plan, calls it the Venezuelan Renaissance. Promises it'll become the Dubai of South America. If you think you've heard that story before, failed state, oil wealth, foreign intervention, reconstruction promises, you're absolutely right. What's about to happen in Venezuela follows a pattern so consistent, so mathematically predictable, that once you see it, you can't unsee it. This isn't speculation, it's historical mechanics. Here's the pattern: 7 stages. Watch how Venezuela checks every single box. Stage 1. Resource Curse Foundation. A nation discovers massive natural resources. The discovery doesn't create prosperity, it replaces the need for institutional development. Why build functioning tax systems, courts, or competitive industries when crude sells itself? Venezuela discovered oil in 1914. By the 1970s, production hit 3.5 million barrels daily, third largest producer globally. The government never built a real economy, just pipelines and corruption. Check. Stage 2. Nationalization and political capture. Leaders realize that controlling resource revenues means infinite patronage. Hugo Chavez takes office in 1999, forces international oil companies into joint ventures where they can hold maximum 40% equity, eliminating their decision-making power. PDVSA, Venezuela's state oil company, becomes a political weapon. $981 billion in oil revenues between 1999 and 2011. Not invested in infrastructure. Not saved. Distributed through social programs that buy loyalty and subsidies that create dependency. Check. Stage 3. Institutional hollowing. As oil money flows, competence becomes optional. PDVSA used to be one of the world's most sophisticated oil companies. By 2015, it's a patronage network staffed by political loyalists who can't maintain equipment or manage reservoirs. Skilled engineers emigrate. 7.7 million Venezuelans, 25% of the population, flee the country. That's not a brain drain, that's a brain hemorrhage. Check. Stage 4. Production collapse. Deferred maintenance compounds. Production falls from 3.5 million barrels daily in the 1990s to 800,000 barrels by 2025. That's a 77% decline. The oil is still there, 300 billion barrels underground. Venezuela just can't extract it anymore. Monthly minimum wage, 130 bolivars. That's 40 cents. The UN defines extreme poverty as $2.15 per day. Venezuelan workers earn 1/5 of that. Check. Stage 5. Default and debt trap. Venezuela accumulated $149.3 billion in foreign debt by 2016, 5.6 times annual exports. Defaults in 2017. Unpaid interest alone, $31 billion. Total liabilities including bilateral debt to China and Russia, multilateral debt to the World Bank, and outstanding bonds, $200 billion. Debt to GDP ratio, 200%. The country owes $2 for every dollar it produces annually. Check. Stage 6. Foreign intervention. External powers intervene militarily. The US captures Maduro, announces direct control over Venezuelan oil sales. Trump states revenues will go to US-controlled accounts at globally recognized banks. That's not reconstruction financing, that's appropriation. Check. Stage 7. Reconstruction promises that never deliver. Venezuela hasn't reached Stage 7 yet, but we know exactly how this ends. Because we've seen this pattern play out in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria. Every single time, the reconstruction estimate proves wildly optimistic. The timeline stretches indefinitely, and the oil revenues disappear into contracts, corruption, and debt service. The pattern is absolute. Let me show you why Venezuela will follow it to the letter. 3 case studies, different centuries, different continents. Identical mechanics. Iraq, 2003. The United States invades, topples Saddam Hussein. Iraq has 140 billion barrels of proven reserves, second only to Saudi Arabia at the time. Paul Bremer announces Iraq will use oil revenues for reconstruction, electricity, water, roads, schools, democracy and prosperity. Initial cost estimate, $50 billion. Actual spending by 2014, over $200 billion in US reconstruction funds alone. Oil production today, 23 years later, still hasn't consistently exceeded pre-war levels. Iraq produces roughly 4 million barrels daily. That's what it produced in 2002. Iraq's reconstruction failed not because of insufficient resources, but because you cannot rebuild institutions in a security vacuum with no legitimate government and every dollar attracting predators. Afghanistan, 2001-2021. Different resource base, minerals, not oil, but identical pattern. The US invades post 9/11, promises to rebuild the nation. Over $145 billion spent on reconstruction. The Afghan government never established territorial control outside Kabul. Reconstruction, contracts funneled money to subcontractors who paid protection money to insurgents. August 2021, the US withdraws. The Afghan government collapses in 11 days. Every institution built over 20 years evaporates. You cannot reconstruct a state that has no institutional memory, no security monopoly, and no fiscal capacity independent of foreign funding. Libya, 2011. NATO intervention topples Muammar Gaddafi. Libya has 48 billion barrels of proven reserves. Light, sweet crude, premium quality. Post-intervention, Libya fractures into competing governments. Militias control oil infrastructure. Production collapses from 1.6 million barrels daily to as low as 200,000. Today, 15 years later, Libya is split between rival governments. Oil production has partially recovered to roughly 1 million barrels daily, but foreign companies operate in conditions of profound instability, and reconstruction remains indefinitely stalled. The pattern repeats: foreign intervention, resource promises, institutional vacuum, reconstruction failure. Now apply this to Venezuela. Venezuela isn't some hypothetical case study. It's already in stages 4 through 6. Let me walk you through what's actually happening on the ground right now, January 2026. The security vacuum. Maduro's gone. Who controls Venezuela? Not the military. It's been systematically gutted through corruption and politicization. Not the police. They haven't been paid in months. Control rests with colectivos, paramilitary groups trained by FARC and the ELN, Colombian guerrilla groups. These aren't teenagers with pistols. They received military training in advanced combat tactics. They control neighborhoods. They enforce political will. They are the de facto government in regions where the state doesn't function. The Trump administration designated the Cartel de los Soles, a network of military officials involved in narco-trafficking, as a foreign terrorist organization in November 2025. Venezuela's security apparatus is inseparable from criminal enterprise. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez faces an impossible choice. She can't disarm thousands of armed colectivos without triggering civil war. But she can't govern with them. Reconstruction requires security. Security requires disarmament. Disarmament requires state capacity that doesn't exist. This is the core paradox. You need a functioning state to rebuild a state. The oil sector mirage. 300 billion barrels of reserves. Sounds incredible. Let me tell you what that actually means. 75% of Venezuela's oil is extra heavy crude, thick as molasses, high sulfur, high metals. It doesn't flow through pipelines without pre-treatment. Either you inject steam into reservoirs or you dilute it with lighter crude at production facilities. Venezuela doesn't have the capital to do either. Current production, 800,000 barrels daily. Peak production in the 1990s, 3.5 million. That's a 77% collapse. Not because the oil is gone, because the infrastructure to extract it has disintegrated. JP Morgan estimates that full restoration of Venezuelan production would require $100 billion in investment annually for 10 years. That's $1 trillion total. Trump met with oil company CEOs in early January 2026. Exxon CEO Darren Woods called Venezuela uninvestable. Not because the reserves aren't there, because there's no functioning government, no enforceable contracts, no legal framework guaranteeing that agreements won't be expropriated. In 2007, Hugo Chavez forced ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil to sell their equity stakes in Venezuelan oil projects at prices below market value. ConocoPhillips won a $9.3 billion arbitration award. Venezuela never paid. Why would any company invest billions now? The Trump administration's answer: the US will control the revenues directly. Trump announced that Venezuela would transfer 30 to 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to US control. The Department of Energy would sell it. Proceeds would go to US-controlled accounts. That's not reconstruction financing. That's seizure of assets under the guise of trusteeship. And here's the kicker. Even if oil production increases, where does the money go? The debt black hole. Venezuela owes $200 billion. Debt to GDP ratio, 200%. Breakdown: $58 billion in Eurobonds issued by Venezuela and PDVSA, $31 billion in accumulated unpaid interest, $19.3 billion owed to China, $2.9 billion owed to Russia, $5 billion to multilateral institutions, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. Then there are the vulture funds, hedge funds that bought Venezuelan bonds at 10 cents on the dollar and are now demanding full repayment. Amber Energy purchased Citgo, Venezuela's crown jewel, its US-based refining complex, for $5.9 billion in a court-ordered auction in November 2025. Venezuela's interim government rejected the sale as fraudulent. But Citgo's gone. Now imagine you're a foreign oil company. You invest $10 billion to restore production. Oil revenues start flowing. Where does that money go? Debt service? Humanitarian aid? Infrastructure investment? Every dollar of oil revenue is subject to competing claims. Bondholders with arbitration awards, Chinese bilateral debt, Russian loans, humanitarian emergencies, electrical grid repairs, repatriation programs for 7.7 million displaced Venezuelans. Debt restructuring in sovereign defaults typically takes years. Argentina's 2001 default wasn't fully resolved until 2016. 15 years. Greece's restructuring in 2012 required EU intervention, IMF loans, and massive write-downs. Venezuela has no such support structure. The IMF isn't offering bailouts. The EU isn't coordinating creditors. The US is expropriating revenues. Standard reconstruction math assumes oil revenues to government treasury to reconstruction spending. Actual Venezuela math: oil revenues to US-controlled accounts to debt service to whatever's left. If debt service consumes all oil revenues, what finances reconstruction? The repatriation fantasy. 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled. That's 25% of the population. They're in Colombia, 2.8 million, Peru, Spain, throughout Latin America and beyond. Trump administration officials reference the Israel model. Israel offers tax incentives to repatriate diaspora populations, 10-year income tax exemptions, 0% tax rates for 2026-2027 on returning residents. There's one problem. Israel has a functioning government, security, rule of law, and an economy. Venezuela has none of those. Why would a Venezuelan engineer in Madrid, earning a professional salary, living in safety, with children in good schools, return to Venezuela for a tax exemption the government can't enforce? Repatriation requires demonstrable improvements in security, employment, services, and currency stability. None of those exist. Historical data on post-conflict return migration shows that returns happen after stabilization, not before. And even then, they're selective. Specific skills, family ties, nationalistic commitment. Broad repatriation of millions? That's a decade away at minimum. If it happens at all, the infrastructure catastrophe. Venezuela depends on a single hydroelectric facility, the Guri Dam, for 80% of national power. It was built in the 1960s, designed for a smaller population. Hasn't been adequately maintained in decades. August 2024. 2 massive blackouts. The first affected 12 states, the second more than 20 states. Caracas was dark for 12 hours, Western states 20 hours. No power means no water treatment, no refrigeration, no telecommunications. An NGO tracking Venezuelan social conflict documented 416 protests related to power disruptions in 2023 alone. Now imagine trying to attract foreign investment. Come build your factory in Venezuela. The power goes out for 20 hours at a time. Electrical grid rehabilitation alone, before addressing roads, water systems, hospitals, schools, would cost tens of billions. Where does that money come from? Oil revenues claimed by creditors? US-controlled accounts prioritizing American strategic interests? The environmental bill. Venezuela's oil is filthy. Extra heavy crude, high sulfur, high metals. Extraction requires massive energy inputs. The International Energy Agency reported that methane emissions from Venezuelan oil operations are 6 times the world average. Flaring intensity, burning off natural gas, is 10 times higher than global norms. Lake Maracaibo, drilled for a century, is one of the most oil-polluted ecosystems on Earth. Nearly 200 documented spills between 2016 and 2021. Those are just the reported ones. Venezuela has lost 2.6 million hectares of tree cover in 2 decades, an area the size of Vermont. Now the Trump administration wants to accelerate production, maximize output, flood the market. Who's monitoring environmental compliance? Who's enforcing cleanup? Who's paying for remediation of a century of contamination? Answer: no one. The pattern holds. Resource extraction, institutional vacuum, environmental devastation. Here's what people always say when you lay this out. This time is different. They point to oil prices. Higher crude prices mean more revenue for reconstruction. They point to technology. Modern drilling techniques make extraction easier and cheaper. They point to political will. Trump's committed. He won't abandon Venezuela like Obama abandoned Iraq. Let me address these directly. Oil prices solve everything. Venezuela's production collapse occurred during periods of high oil prices. Between 2010 and 2014, crude averaged over $100 per barrel. Production still fell. Why? Because high prices don't fix broken infrastructure, incompetent management, or institutional rot. Oil at $80 per barrel is worthless if you can't extract it, transport it, or refine it. Technology makes extraction easier. True, for conventional crude. Venezuela's extra heavy oil requires steam injection or dilution. Those aren't technological problems, they're capital and operational problems. You need functioning infrastructure, continuous maintenance, skilled workers, reliable electricity, and operational discipline. Venezuela has none of those. Technology doesn't replace institutions. American commitment is different. Really? Let's check the record. Iraq, 20 years, $200 billion, still dysfunctional. Afghanistan, 20 years, $145 billion, collapsed in 11 days. Libya, 15 years, still fractured between rival governments. The United States is exceptionally bad at state building, not because Americans lack good intentions, but because you cannot impose institutions from outside. Institutions emerge from domestic political settlements, not foreign blueprints. Venezuela is larger than Iraq, more indebted than Libya, more institutionally collapsed than Afghanistan. And Trump's plan is to control oil revenues indefinitely, while Venezuelan debt claims multiply and paramilitary groups maintain de facto territorial control. That's not a plan. That's imperialism without the competence. This time is never different. The mechanics are identical: resource curse, institutional collapse, foreign intervention, reconstruction promises, debt claims, security vacuum, and ultimate failure. The pattern is absolute. So what happens next? 3 scenarios, none of them good. Scenario 1. Prolonged stagnation. Reconstruction spending begins, some oil production increases, maybe to 1.2 million barrels daily within 3 years. Debt service consumes revenues, infrastructure improvements are marginal, security remains fragile. A 2-tier society emerges: foreign oil workers and Venezuelan elites in gated compounds with private generators, everyone else in permanent crisis. 7.7 million diaspora Venezuelans stay abroad. Some skilled workers return for high-wage oil sector jobs, but broad repatriation never materializes. Venezuela becomes a permanent ward of international intervention, nominally sovereign, functionally administered. This is the optimistic scenario. Scenario 2. Collapse acceleration. Reconstruction proves slower than promised. Rival factions contest interim government legitimacy. Collectivos resist disarmament. Violence escalates. International companies pull out. Oil production stagnates or declines further. Debt defaults continue indefinitely. More Venezuelans emigrate. Population falls below 20 million. The nation enters a death spiral where declining population, collapsing institutions, and persistent insecurity create a self-reinforcing cycle of failure. Venezuela becomes the Western Hemisphere's Somalia, a territory with borders but no functioning state. Scenario 3. Authoritarian reset. A strongman, maybe a military figure, maybe a civilian with military backing, seizes power. Promises order and reconstruction. Crushes collectivos through overwhelming force. Establishes functional repression. Negotiates debt write-downs by threatening permanent default. Oil production increases under direct military management. Venezuela becomes a petro-state dictatorship, aligned with US interests, economically functional, politically unfree. This is how most failed state reconstructions actually end, not with democracy and prosperity, but with a new authoritarian bargain. The Marshall Plan worked because Europe had institutional memory. Japan rebuilt because it had a competent bureaucracy and cooperative culture. Venezuela has none of that. It has oil, debt, paramilitaries, and foreign occupation. The pattern has played out dozens of times. It will play out again. January 3rd, 2026, the day Maduro was captured. That's when the clock started. The Trump administration has maybe 18 months, 2 years maximum, before reconstruction momentum collapse. If oil revenues don't rapidly translate into security improvements, basic services, and employment within that window, the entire project fails. Diaspora Venezuelans decide whether to return based on what they see in year 1. If it's more blackouts, more insecurity, more broken promises, they stay abroad permanently. International oil companies assess political risk continuously. If Venezuela remains uninvestable into 2027, capital goes elsewhere. Nigeria, Guyana, US shale. Creditors multiply. Every month Venezuela doesn't restructure debt, interest accumulates, legal claims proliferate, and the debt burden becomes mathematically unsustainable. The reconstruction either happens fast, security, oil production, debt restructuring, services, repatriation, or it doesn't happen at all. And based on every historical precedent, every comparable case study, every pattern we've examined, it doesn't happen. Venezuela will not become the Dubai of South America. It will become another Iraq, another Libya, another case study in how resource wealth without institutions creates permanent failure. The pattern is absolute. This time is never different. Subscribe now because the next video reveals the 3 specific economic indicators that will tell us, definitively, whether Venezuelan reconstruction is succeeding or collapsing. Those indicators are measurable, they're undeniable, and they're already moving. Hit the notification bell. You need to see this data before the window closes entirely. The wealth transfer is coming. The only question is, who captures it and who gets crushed?